Ever notice how after an aircraft incident, the investigation always seems to come back to, like, the same few words?
You mean like pilot error?
Well, yeah, but even more. Like, they'll say it was complacency, or maybe the pilots weren't paying enough attention, or they were just too tired. It's always something like that.
I see what you mean. It's like they're trying to sum up this whole complicated event with just one word.
Exactly. And it makes you think, does that really tell us what happened? Do those labels really explain why things went wrong?
That's a really good point. They're almost too simple, right? They're handy, but they don't really get to the heart of it.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going to try and go deeper than those easy answers, especially for you.
We are, and we're going to do that by looking at things from a pilot's point of view. How do human factors, the way our minds work, play a role in aviation safety? And what we've been reading suggests that to really understand these incidents, we need to look at things from the pilot's perspective at the time, not just backward, with hindsight.
Like putting ourselves in their shoes.
Exactly. What were they dealing with? What decisions were they making as the situation was unfolding?
I like that. And we've got some really interesting material to help us do that. Insights into how they actually do these incident investigations and how pilots manage risk, all from the perspective of a master airline pilot.
Tons of experience.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out, for you listening, this isn't just for pilots. Understanding these underlying factors, how decisions get made under pressure, how we perceive and deal with risk, how situations can change and become complicated.
It can get messy.
Right. Those are valuable lessons for any field, really, any time the stakes are high. Whether you're prepping for a big presentation, managing a tough project, heck, even just trying to understand how the world works a little better. This stuff is useful.
For sure. Human factors are everywhere.
Okay. So let's dig in. And maybe the best place to start is with this trap of hindsight. We've all been there. It's so easy to look back and go, well, obviously they should have done this, or why didn't they see that coming?
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like our instinct. But what's interesting is how often incident investigations fall into that same trap.
Really?
Yeah. It's called hindsight bias. Basically, it means that once something has happened, we tend to see it as being predictable.
Like it was obvious all along.
Exactly. And that can lead us to judge the decisions of those involved, often the pilots, as obviously flawed.
Like they should have known better.
Right. And that's where things get tricky because, as our source makes very clear, pilots don't climb into that cockpit wanting to make mistakes.
Of course not. They want to do everything by the book.
Exactly. They start every single flight aiming for a safe outcome. So the real question becomes, what happens along the way? What changes that trajectory from safe to, well, not safe?
Right. What shifts that balance? It can't just be bad decisions, right? There has to be more to it.
There is. And this is where just labeling something as, let's say, poor risk management falls short. Sure, it might look good in a report, but it doesn't actually give us the whole picture of what happened from the crew's perspective.
It's missing that human element.
Exactly. It doesn't tell us what they were seeing, what they were thinking, what pressures they might have been facing. And without that deeper understanding, it becomes much harder to learn and actually improve safety.
So how do we get that deeper understanding? How do we move beyond hindsight?
By shifting our perspective. Instead of just looking at the outcome, the what, we need to focus on the process, the how. We need to put ourselves in their shoes and understand how events unfolded moment by moment.
So instead of just looking at what went wrong, we start asking different questions, like, what were the pilots thinking and feeling in the moments leading up to the incident?
Exactly. What were their expectations? What assumptions did they have going in? What information did they have? And maybe more importantly, what didn't they know?
And what were they paying attention to?
Yes, absolutely. What cues did they pick up on? What might they have missed and why? And then you have the whole context of their mindset. What was influencing it at the start? And how did it change as things went on?
That's fascinating. Like, were they feeling rushed? Were they stressed?
Exactly. All of that matters. And then the workload itself. How much were they juggling at once?
So many factors.
So many factors. And what's so interesting is that by looking at it this way, those simple labels, complacency, inattention, they start to lose their meaning. They become almost meaningless.
Because they're not really explanations.
Right. They're just labels. This new perspective, though, it allows us to start seeing how these seemingly unrelated factors can combine and interact, sometimes in unpredictable ways, to lead to undesirable outcomes. It's rarely a straight path to an incident. And maybe most importantly for you, listening, it helps us recognize our own potential vulnerabilities. It's not about pointing fingers at those pilots. It's about understanding that in the right or wrong, I guess, circumstances, any of us could find ourselves making similar mistakes.
That's a sobering thought. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of seeing the situation as it happened. Now let's dive into some of those core aviation safety concepts.
Sounds good.
And let's start with risk management. Seems so basic, right?
It does, but the fundamental truth is that aviation inherently involves risk.
Well, yeah, you're flying a giant metal tube through the air.
Exactly. You can't eliminate all risk. So the approach is twofold. First, do everything you can to reduce and mitigate risk. And then, manage whatever risk remains. Kind of like layers of protection.
So you're always aware that risk is there. But risk isn't a fixed thing, right? It changes constantly.
Exactly. It's dynamic, and that makes it tough. It's influenced by the conditions you're flying in, any vulnerabilities in the system, the capabilities and limitations of both the aircraft and the people flying it. All these things are interacting with each other. And because it's so dynamic, we can't always know for sure when a situation crosses the line from risky to unsafe.
So there's this whole gray area.
Absolutely. Lots of shades of gray in aviation. And it's in that gray area where things get really interesting and potentially dangerous.
It seems like there would be a lot of pressure to push into that gray area.
There is.
Yeah.
And especially in commercial aviation, where there's this tension between the need to operate profitably and the commitment to safety.
Well, yeah, airlines are businesses. They have to make money.
Right. And while every airline will say that safety is paramount, the financial realities of the business often incentivize decisions that increase risk. Think about it. Things like canceling flights due to bad weather, carrying extra fuel just in case, or even investing in more robust training programs, those all cut into profits.
They do.
And those things often get weighed against maximizing aircraft utilization, running tight schedules, and operating with minimal staffing, all of which can increase risk.
So there's this constant push and pull between being efficient and being safe.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. And what's even more interesting is that success in managing risk, especially when it involves pushing those boundaries, can actually lead to increased risk tolerance over time.
Because if it worked before.
Right. We got away with it last time, so it must be okay. And every time it works out, that confidence grows, both for the organization and for individual pilots. It becomes this self-reinforcing cycle.
And the lines get blurred.
They do. Now, of course, we have regulations. Those are supposed to be those hard lines in the sand, right? They set limits.
Right. So everything's fine as long as you stay within those limits.
Well, here's the thing. Operating within regulatory limits doesn't always equal safe operation.
Wait, really? How did that work?
Our source points out that the regulations establish these absolute limits, but there's still a lot of room within those limits. It's like, think of a speed limit. Just because you're driving under the speed limit doesn't mean it's safe to go that fast in every situation.
Oh, right. Like if it's raining or foggy, you should probably slow down even if you're technically still under the limit.
Exactly. And in aviation, you can have situations where multiple factors that are individually within limits combine to create a pretty risky scenario.
Like a perfect storm of within limits factors.
Exactly. Our source uses this great example. You could have a very inexperienced captain, maybe just upgraded, flying with an equally inexperienced first officer.
So a brand new?
Brand new. Both of them are at the maximum allowable duty hours. They're tired. They're flying an aircraft with some minor maintenance issues.
Still legal, though.
Still legal. And they're doing it in marginal weather, maybe low visibility or strong winds. Again, all within limits. But the combination of all those factors is, well, let's just say most pilots would be pretty uncomfortable with that situation.
I can see why.
And this is where the real crux of risk management comes in. Because unless someone higher up in the organization steps in, it's ultimately up to the pilots to decide if it's safe to go.
So they become the last line of defense.
They are. As our source puts it, they are the final arbiters of acceptable risk and the final barrier against an accident.
Speaking of barriers, this reminds me of the Swiss cheese model. How did that fit into this?
Ah, the Swiss cheese model. Such a great way to visualize how safety works and how it can sometimes fail.
I love that model. For those who haven't heard of it, can you explain how it works?
Sure. So picture several slices of Swiss cheese all stacked up. Each slice represents a different layer of defense in the aviation system.
Okay, so you've got, what, the regulations?
Yep, those are a layer. And then things like company procedures, aircraft maintenance, air traffic control, pilot training. Even the design of the aircraft itself, each layer has its own holes representing weaknesses or
The
vulnerabilities.
holes in the Swiss cheese.
Right. Most of the time, those holes don't line up. If there's a problem, one of the layers will catch it and stop it from turning into an accident.
Like a safety net.
Exactly.
Right.
But every now and then, the holes in those layers do line up, and that's when an accident happens.
So building more layers and making the existing ones stronger, that's how we prevent accidents.
Right. It's all about reducing those vulnerability, shrinking those holes, and that's where safety programs come in. But our source points out something really important. While the organization, the company, the regulators, they all put those big picture defenses in place, the pilot is the immediate defense.
They're on the front line.
Exactly. They are the ones in the cockpit, in real time, seeing those conditions change, reacting to those unexpected events. And that pilot barrier itself is actually multi-layered.
Because it's not just one person making all the decisions.
Right. You've got the pilot flying, the PF, who's actually controlling the aircraft, and you've got the pilot monitoring, the PM, who's backing them up.
So each of them is a layer of defense. What are their strengths and weaknesses?
Well, the pilot flying has the advantage of being in the loop, so to speak. They know exactly what they intend to do at any given moment, but the downside is they can get so focused on flying the plane that they might not see the bigger picture, or they might get overloaded and miss important cues.
And the pilot monitoring.
The PM has that broader perspective. They're not actively flying, so they can monitor the situation, look for potential problems, check that things are going according to plan, but their weakness is that they're not in the PF's head.
Right. They have to guess what the other pilot is thinking.
Exactly. And communication is key, but communication can break down, especially under stress. Then, of course, you have the flight crew team as a whole. When they work well together, when they're communicating effectively and coordinating their actions, that's a strong barrier. But if that teamwork breaks down, it creates a huge vulnerability.
Our source also mentioned some other really interesting factors that can affect those safety barriers, like how familiar a pilot is with a particular operation.
Right. And this is something that might surprise people. Familiarity, while generally a good thing, can actually lead to what our source calls laxity, that loosening of focus and attention that can happen when things are going as expected.
Like you've done it 1,000 times before, so you're not as sharp.
Exactly. It's this human tendency to kind of relax and go on autopilot when things feel routine. The pilot flying might not be as vigilant. The pilot monitoring might get distracted by other tasks.
It's the danger of complacency.
Right. And then, of course, you have those phases of flight where things can go wrong very quickly.
Like landing.
Landing, takeoff, taxiing. Those phases require a higher level of engagement from both pilots.
Makes sense.
And then anytime you have unexpected changes, that throws things off as well. Something happens that you weren't anticipating, and that can disrupt the flow, the coordination, the communication between the pilots.
Like a sudden change in weather.
That, or a mechanical issue, or even just air traffic control giving you a different clearance than you were expecting. All of a sudden, the situation's different, and you have to adapt.
Our source also talks about this concept of failed anticipation by the PM.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. It's that tendency to just assume that the pilot flying is on top of things, even when there are signs that maybe they're not.
Because they have more experience, maybe?
It could be that, or just a general reluctance to speak up and question the other pilot.
And then finally, there's this idea of misaligned perspectives. It's like both pilots are looking at the same thing, but drawing the wrong conclusions.
And that's the scary one, because the whole system is designed to have those independent checks. But if the PF and the PM are both making the same assumptions, missing the same cues, well, then that safety net is gone.
So we've talked about the inherent risks in flying and all these barriers and safeguards that are designed to prevent accidents. But how do pilots actually go about assessing risk in the moment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's even more complex because, as our source emphasizes, we're talking about skilled professional pilots who generally don't set out to make bad decisions.
Right, they're not reckless.
Yeah.
So why do things go wrong?
It's not about intentionally being unsafe. It's about how we perceive and interpret risk, how we weigh those potential consequences against the desired outcome. And our source introduces this concept of a risk management model to help visualize this.
Okay, I like models.
So picture a line, a continuum, with choices ranging from conservative to hazardous.
Conservative on one end, hazardous on the other.
Exactly. On the far left, the conservative end, we have pilots who add extra margins of safety. They'll carry more fuel than required. They'll get the aircraft configured for landing earlier. They'll be extra cautious in their decision-making.
So they're playing it super safe.
Absolutely. And while this can enhance safety, it's not always the most efficient way to operate.
So the airlines probably don't encourage that.
They don't. Moving toward the center, you have the balanced risk area. This is the sweet spot where companies typically train their pilots to operate. It's where they're aiming for that optimal balance between efficiency and safety.
So that's what they consider good risk management.
Right. And then, as we move further to the right, we enter the zone of increased risk, where choices are becoming more aggressive.
And what might push pilots into that zone?
Lots of things. Sometimes it's just personality. Some pilots naturally have a higher tolerance for risk. Sometimes it's external pressure, a push from dispatch to save fuel, or maybe air traffic control, giving them a shortcut that requires them to fly faster or make tighter turns.
And sometimes it's just the situation itself that changes.
Absolutely. Unexpected events like deteriorating weather or mechanical issues can force pilots into riskier decisions.
Okay, so the further you go to the right on this line, the riskier the choices become.
Exactly. And as we keep moving rightward, we cross this too much risk threshold. This is where the probability of things going wrong starts to increase significantly. It's not a hard line, more of a gray area. And then at the far right, you have extreme risk, where it's almost guaranteed that something bad will happen.
I like how our source talks about pilot personalities and how they approach risk. We all know people who are naturally more cautious and others who seem to thrive on taking risks.
Right. And those tendencies definitely show up in the cockpit. So you've got your conservative pilots who add those extra margins of safety, but ironically, they get less practice dealing with those challenging, high-risk situations. Then you've got your standardized pilots who try to operate right around that balanced risk line, following the company's procedures and guidelines. And then you've got your aggressive pilots.
The ones who like to push the envelope.
Exactly. They might be very skilled, but they're more likely to make riskier choices, often justifying those choices by saying they can handle it.
And this brings us back to that gray area of increasing risk.
Right. And this is where things get tricky, because even the most standardized pilot will sometimes find themselves having to operate in that zone.
Because things change, unexpected things happen.
Exactly. And the edges of that gray area aren't clear. It's hard to know exactly when you've crossed the line into too much risk. And the more experience a pilot has, the more finely tuned their risk tolerance bell curve becomes.
So they know what they can handle.
They do. But there are all sorts of factors that affect how gray that gray area is.
Like what?
Things like the complexity of the situation, how novel it is, how much time pressure there is, how fatigued the pilots are, how startled or surprised they might be, even their overall outlook and their skill at assessing risk.
So if you're tired or you're dealing with something new and unexpected, that gray area becomes even more difficult to navigate.
Exactly. And our source gives the example of a deteriorating weather situation on approach to landing. As the weather gets worse, that margin for error shrinks, that gray area compresses, and it becomes harder and harder to judge whether the risk is acceptable or not.
And that brings us to what our source calls the proficient pilot's path to failure. And it's not about pilots intentionally messing up. It's about how even skilled, experienced pilots operating in this ambiguous gray zone of risk can find themselves on a trajectory toward an incident.
It's almost like an invisible path.
It is. And a big part of that path, as our source points out, is that most pilots, in their everyday flying, don't actually experience those catastrophic failure scenarios. So when things do start to go wrong, it can be really hard to recognize those subtle warning signs that you're heading toward disaster.
Because you've never been there before.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, they use this really interesting case study, a visual approach gone wrong, what they call Clem's bad day.
Poor Clem.
Right. So can you walk us through what happened?
So Clem was a very experienced captain, no history of any issues, good pilot. This one day, he's cleared for a visual approach to a short runway.
A short runway always adds a bit of extra challenge.
It does, and he's running a bit behind schedule, so he delays configuring the aircraft for landing, wanting to get closer to the airport before slowing down.
Trying to save a little time.
Exactly. But then he realizes he's a bit too high and a bit too fast. Yeah, he's a little too close in. He starts doing what seem like normal things to slow down, reduce power, lowers the landing gear and the flaps. He gets on the right glide path, but he can't seem to get his speed down.
He's still coming in hot.
He is. He tries making his descent shallower, puts the flaps all the way down, still too fast, still too high. He lowers the nose, hoping that'll help bleed off some speed. No dice.
So what does he do?
At this point, he feels like he's close enough to the runway, so he commits to landing.
Even though he's still going too fast.
He is, but he's hoping that a reported headwind will help him slow down once he touches down.
Ah, okay, so he's counting on that headwind.
He is. But unfortunately, what he doesn't know is that the wind has actually shifted and is now a tailwind.
Oh, no. So instead of helping him slow down, it's going to push him faster.
Exactly. Just before touchdown, he raises the nose a bit too high. He's trying to avoid hitting the tail on the runway, a perfectly normal thing to do. But because he's still going too fast, he ends up touching down way further down the runway than he should have.
He's running out of runway.
He is. And to make matters worse, there's a patch of runway that's unexpectedly slippery due to some recent light rain on what was a very dusty surface.
Oh, wow. A hidden hazard?
Exactly. Nobody had reported it, so Clem had no way of knowing. He loses control of the aircraft and ends up sliding off the end of the runway.
So Clem's having a very bad day.
He is. Luckily, nobody's hurt.
Thank goodness for that.
Right. But the aircraft is damaged. Now, it's easy to look back and say Clem should have gone around, aborted the landing when he realized things weren't going right. But as our source points out, what we need to do is try to see the situation from Clem's perspective in that moment.
Because in the heat of the moment, things are different.
They are. Every action he took, reducing power, lowering the gear, adjusting the flaps, lowering the nose, those were all logical, normal responses to problems he'd encountered and successfully handled before.
So he was just doing what he knew how to do.
Exactly. What he didn't realize was that the combination of those factors, the late configuration, the high energy state, that unexpected tailwind, they created a situation that was outside his normal experience. And then you add in that unknown slippery runway condition, and it becomes this recipe for disaster.
And this is where that concept of the recognition trap comes in.
The recognition trap. Such a sneaky thing. It describes how experienced people, like pilots, can misidentify a situation, often one that's uncommon and unfavorable, as something familiar. And because they think they recognize it, they apply a previously successful, but now flawed, game plan.
They think they've seen this movie before, but they haven't.
Exactly. And this ties into what Gary Klein calls recognition primed decision-making, or RPDM.
Okay, another model. I like it.
RPDM basically describes how experts make decisions in time-critical, high-stakes environments. It's based on the idea that when we encounter a new situation, we quickly try to match it to similar events from our past.
So we're looking for patterns.
Right. If we recognize the situation, we can then apply the same mental models and decision-making strategies that worked before. And in most cases, it works great. But when the situation is actually new and different, that reliance on past experience can trip us up.
Like in Clem's case.
Right. He was cleared for a visual approach, something he had done hundreds, maybe thousands of times before, so he subconsciously slotted it into that familiar category, applied his usual approach strategy, and failed to see that the specific conditions of this particular approach were, well, way outside the norm.
So the very experience that makes him a good pilot, that ability to quickly recognize and react to situations, also becomes his downfall.
Exactly. And it's not just pilots. This happens in all sorts of professions, especially those that involve a high level of expertise. Think about doctors, firefighters, even business leaders.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap?
Well, the first step is awareness. Recognizing that the recognition trap exists, understanding how it works, and being vigilant about questioning our assumptions, especially when things aren't going as expected.
So don't be too quick to assume you know what's happening.
Exactly. Always be willing to reevaluate. Now, our source uses a simple model to illustrate the different ways we recognize situations and how those can lead to either good decisions or bad decisions.
Another model. Lay it on me.
Imagine a simple 4-block grid. On one axis, you have familiar situation and unfamiliar situation. On the other axis, you have common situation and uncommon situation.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
In the bottom left quadrant, you have recognized as common. This is where most of our routine, everyday experiences fall. We recognize the situation, we apply our standard procedures, and things go as expected.
Like Clem being cleared for that visual approach. That's a common scenario for an experienced pilot.
Exactly. Now, in the top right quadrant, you have recognized as uncommon. This is where we correctly identify a situation as being unusual or outside our normal experience.
So we know we need to pay closer attention.
Right. We might need to gather more information or come up with a new plan, maybe even abort the approach and go around.
What about those other two quadrants?
Well, the bottom right quadrant is what we call the conservative error. This is where we mistakenly identify a common situation as being uncommon.
So we overreact.
Kind of. We might be extra cautious or take unnecessary actions.
Inefficient, but probably not dangerous.
Right. It's an error, but it's usually on the side of safety. But the most dangerous quadrant is the top left, the recognition trap error.
Where the uncommon situation is misidentified as common.
Exactly. And this is where things can go really wrong. We think we've seen it before, so we apply a familiar solution that's not appropriate for this particular situation. And because we're confident in our assessment, we might not even see the warning signs that things are going wrong.
Like Clem, plowing ahead with his approach even though things were clearly not going as planned.
Exactly. And this trap is made even more dangerous by our tendency to rationalize our decisions. Remember how we were talking about how Clem kept trying to fix each problem as it arose without really questioning the overall plan?
Right. He was so focused on those individual problems that he missed the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's a classic symptom of the recognition trap. We get so fixated on making our initial plan work that we lose sight of what's actually happening.
And what's scary is that when we're in that trap, instead of questioning our judgment, we often start doubting our own abilities.
Right. Instead of thinking, maybe this plan isn't working, we think, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I get this right? And that self-doubt can make things even worse.
It can paralyze us.
It can. We hesitate, we second-guess ourselves, and we end up reacting instead of acting decisively. It's interesting because, as our source points out, pilots involved in incidents often have a hard time recalling the specifics of the event later on.
Well, they block it out.
It's not quite that dramatic, but their memories tend to be fragmented, focused on general impressions rather than specific details, and they often underestimate how bad the situation actually was. They'll say things like, I thought I had it under control, or it didn't seem that serious at the time.
I guess when you're in the middle of a high-stress situation, it can be hard to see things clearly.
It is. It's like tunnel vision. You're so focused on one thing that you miss everything else that's going on around you.
So how do pilots get better at managing risk, especially in those moments when things are going wrong? It seems like being able to quickly and accurately assess the situation and knowing when to abandon a plan that's not working, that's crucial.
It is, and our source talks about how critical threat detection is. Recognizing when things are starting to deviate from the expected and knowing how to respond appropriately.
So being aware of those subtle cues, those early warning signs.
Exactly, and they use a great example, the first officer who comes back from a long absence and misses a routine radio call.
I've been there.
We all have. And what's interesting is that this pilot, even though they were experienced, they felt this overwhelming sense of self-recrimination. Like, how could I have missed that? What's wrong with me?
It can really shake your confidence.
It can. And it highlights this really important point. Even experienced pilots have limitations. And stress, fatigue, unusual circumstances, all those things can expose those limitations. And this leads us to what our source calls the levels of knowing, which I think is a really helpful way to think about how we approach risk and decision making.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear about these levels of knowing.
So the first level is we know what we know. This is the biggest category for most experienced pilots. They encounter a situation, they recognize it, they have a plan, and they execute it successfully. The second level is we know what we don't know. This is where we're aware of the gaps in our knowledge. We might not have encountered a particular situation before, but we know it exists, and we have some idea of what to do about it.
Okay, so far so good. What about the other levels?
Well, the third level is where things start to get a bit more, shall we say, interesting. This is the we don't know what we don't know level.
That sounds like dangerous territory.
It can be, because in these situations, we're dealing with the truly unknown. We might feel uncomfortable with this lack of knowledge, and that can lead to us oversimplifying the situation or making assumptions based on incomplete information.
We try to make it fit into something we do know.
Exactly, which can lead to all sorts of bad decisions. But the most dangerous level, the one that really sets the stage for the recognition trap, is the fourth level. We think we know what we actually don't know.
It's like a false sense of confidence.
Exactly. We think we recognize the situation, so.
Wow.